Good morning and welcome to this session. But first of all, welcome to a corner of Africa in India. If you have been here before, welcome to Gujarat State. If you have been to Gujarat State before, I will welcome you not to Ahmedabad, which is where you think you are, but you're actually in Gandhinagar. So in case you're calling home, don't tell them you're in Ahmedabad, tell them you're in Gandhinagar, which is just next to Ahmedabad. So welcome to that as well. If you have been to Gandhinagar before, welcome to the Mahatma Mandir Conference Center. If you have been there before, welcome to Seminar Hall 4. And I think that covers all the bases. We're here to receive or to hear from a very important report, which is the African Economic Outlook, and we shall be, this will be discussed by several distinguished people, and I want to invite them to come up to stage. I shall begin with Abebe Shimeles. His name was on screen just now before I lost it. Oh, there it is. Abebe Shimeles, welcome. I'll also ask Mario Pezzini to please come up. Angela Lusigi, please, if you can please come up. I will also ask Abdallah Hamdok. Dr. Hamdok, I saw you a few minutes ago. Please join us up here on stage. There you are. We also have several distinguished people, which is all of you, but several more I have noticed. We have some of the governors of the bank, others known as finance ministers. We have Finance Minister Gatete from Rwanda, who's sitting here at the front, Finance Minister Rotich from Kenya sitting here at the front, and a few others. We shall be recognizing you as this morning's session goes on. So this session, as it says on your screen, is the African Economic Outlook for 2017. Where are we? It's been quite an interesting decade, and I think it's important for us to take what's called a dipstick check of where we are as African economies. My name is Wallace Kantai from India. Well, not quite, but for now from India. And I will be taking you through this session this morning. Just a few quick announcements. One is we've told you about the translation from the 4 languages, English, French, Arabic, and Portuguese. We now have more or less sorted out the sound problem we had before. So we have people coming around to distribute the translation devices. They're coming around, so they'll be with you in the next few minutes. If you don't have, get one in about 2 or 3 minutes. Just put your hand up and they'll try and get one to you. The second thing is, the way this session is going to run, we're going to have a few presentations being made from the different speakers. We'll have a few responses, and then we will try and come to you on the floor to have some of your submissions. So don't worry, we'll try and integrate as much from you as possible. So in case you were not here at the very beginning, the report is available on a USB stick. That USB stick will be distributed right at the very end, so you don't need to worry about taking too many notes now. You'll get the full report that's being presented at the very end of this process. You can pick it up on a USB stick to look at, interrogate, and analyze at your leisure and pleasure. So again, we welcome you. We want to begin this session, and I want to ask Abebe Shimeles, who is Acting Director for Macroeconomics Policy, Forecasting, and Research at the bank, that is the Africa Development Bank, to please come and start the session.
Thank you, moderator. Good morning, everyone. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of the African Economic Outlook 2017. For our Indian hosts, Namaskar, Ram Ram, Kya hale, theek hai, sab theek hai. So it's really a pleasure to be in India, a land of the mystics, and also a land of mystery, success, and also a good example for Africa. The African Economic Outlook that we launch in this occasion started in 2001, and it has grown in stature relevance, and also significance across the continent. But most importantly for the African Development Bank, where we believe a flagship report is not just an occasion for few researchers to write a report and then launch it in an event like this, and then go home. It's a document we believe should be able to inspire, to influence, and to inform. So in that regard, I want to say a few things about the African Economic Outlook. In the bank, what you have in front of you is the main report. However, along this report also we have 54 country notes that we produce, but normally we don't see them in the launch. And that makes this document a unique vehicle for the bank also potentially to engage with the regional member countries, to inform its own operational activities, but also build the capacity of its economists. These 54 country notes are prepared by our country economists and lead economists, and also reviewed by director generals and cleared by the vice presidency. But also the main reports are also discussed and reviewed by our vice presidents. As a result, this document has a wider reach than any other product that we produce at the bank. So with this introduction, the 2017 Economic Outlook for Africa consists of chapters looking at the economic outlook for the continent from 2016 up to 2019. But also it discusses issues of financial flows into the continent, and also trade issues, human development issues, political and economic governance. These are what we call recurrent chapters of the African Economic Outlook. Most importantly, also, it discusses every year emerging and important thematic issues. This year, the theme for the African Economic Outlook is entrepreneurship and industrialization. An important, you all agree with me, subject for the African economic transformation, for the continent that we all wish to achieve. In my brief intervention today, I'll be just looking at the macroeconomic perspective. My colleagues from OECD, who are the partners and the founders of this report, represented by Mario Pazzini, will be talking on the thematic part of the report. And our other partner, UNDP, will be discussing by Angela the human development report for this one. So we'll try to wrap it up within the next 30 minutes and then wait for interventions from the Executive Secretary, Hamdok, and others, and then from the audience. On my part, what I'll be looking at is what's happening on the growth and other macroeconomic aggregates in Africa. What are the drivers of growth? Not those generic ones, but particularly important and the ones we try to understand better. And also, we do a reflection on the stability of the macroeconomy of African countries. As most of us know, the year 2016, and prior to that also 2015, has been a time of slowing down in the pace of economic growth in Africa, which is basically the end of what we call the commodity price supercycle. That has basically fueled some of the growth in the continent. However, we also recognize that the slowdown in the African economies is not the feature of all African economies. It's a heterogeneous continent, 54 countries. Actually, 4 of the fastest growing countries in the world are located in Africa. That includes Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal. But also, more than 18 African countries grow at a rate higher than 5%, even in 2016, despite several global and regional shocks. So with this, we expect in 2017 and 18, the outlook to improve due to several positive headwinds, which I will explain shortly. When we unpack the growth in GDP for African countries, for 2016, we've observed the factors that have led to a decline in some of the countries, the most important ones, including the largest economy, Nigeria, and also South Africa, has weighed down on the pace of growth in Africa. This is largely in Nigeria, for instance, the long-drawn and low commodity price, particularly oil, and also Angola, but also the anemic growth we have observed for quite some time in South Africa, which has also weighed down in that region, including the drought that has affected the entire Horn and Southern Africa, but also the international economic atmosphere, where the major trading partners of Africa have seen their economy also slowing down during 2016, including China and Europe. So with this, what we can look at in terms of the drivers of growth when we decompose the factors that affect, and which is very important for us to take away from this type of analysis, is that still the main driver of Africa's economic growth, when you decompose it by its components, the private consumption part still plays a major role. This is normally not a feature that you see in countries that are sustaining and experiencing sustaining growth and experiencing a structural transformation, where growth comes from investment and exports. So the idea for the African countries to be transformed is basically to shift the source of growth away from consumption to more investment and exports. So this basically is one of the factors. When we say a strong demand is driving Africa's growth, we are also cautioning that this drive in consumption expenditure, powered by increasing population and also the middle income, the middle class, should not be a source of comfort. For low income, most African countries, what is most important is for their growth to be driven by investment, as I said, and exports. The commodity prices, as I have indicated earlier, have had some dent, some impact on some of the economies, particularly those that rely on these resources. So we expect, as we made our forecast for 2017 and 18, a recovery in the price of the oil and other commodities that would support the recovery of growth in some countries. So, but I want to say also that the myth that African economy is really driven by just resources is not also true. If you look at actually over the last 15 years, the fastest growing economies in Africa have been non-commodity oil, non-commodity dependent countries. But most importantly also, even for those countries that rely on commodities, the effect of prices on growth is very small. Actually, it is a secondary effect is that generally are worse than what it looks. Another factor that we expect why African economies will do better in 2016 and 2017 and 18 is also improving business environment. When you look at the competitiveness index for many African countries, it has improved largely. When you look at the average, actually, African countries are close to Latin America and the Caribbean, and even some countries much better. Again, a very good example we have is Rwanda, Kenya, Mauritius, Ghana, Senegal, who have really done a lot in the past few years to improve the business environment, the business climate for investment. Finally, we conclude that sustaining growth for African countries at a faster rate can only happen in the environment of structural transformation. Even when you unpack the growth trajectories for the countries by the region, Eastern Africa has had quite a smooth ride, even during the crisis in 2008-9, and also the oil price fall in 2014. The rest of the continent, Central Africa, Western Africa, and also Southern Africa, tend to be held back by lack of structural transformation. In this graph, for instance, what we show is the larger a country's export concentration into one commodity, the lower the long-term growth, particularly growth acceleration. Therefore, in this report, we highlight the importance of a structural transformation, which basically is the highlight of also the bank's interventions. Finally, macroeconomic stability in Africa is on solid ground. Despite the low growth that we have experienced, fiscal deficit, inflation, and also current account deficit has remained manageable levels. They have not deteriorated. And actually, most countries are in a high growth, low fiscal deficit regime. So with this, let me just conclude the session on the macroeconomic part, and then we go to entrepreneurship and industry. I pass it to you. Thank you for your hearing.
Thank you very much, Abebe. And we have the pleasure of being joined by the President of the Africa Development Bank, President Adesina. Welcome. He sneaked in, so you didn't notice. He walked very quietly in, but he's here with us. And the rest of you that have just joined us, please feel welcome. We're discussing the Africa Economic Outlook for 2017. And as Abebe has very ably said, we're going to hear from the first Italian on our panel. That's Mario Pezzini, who is the director of the OECD Development Center.
Mr. President, Administrator of the Bank, dear friends, it's a pleasure to be with you today and to address the second part of the report. You have heard I'm Italian. I didn't know which language to use. Don't have a choice. My English is not good. French is like the English, and Italian is the worst. So the situation that has been described is a situation that needs to be put in a context, and the general context is not necessarily a positive context internationally. Let me recall to you that Latin America this year has negative rate of growth as an average. Southeast Asia is behaving differently. The average is around 5%, which means that despite the slight reduction of growth in China, there are still strong engines of growth there. So Africa is somehow in the middle in this general context. And therefore, one of the preoccupations we had was to say, what can we do in order to push farther? Our colleague from the African Development Bank suggests we concentrate on entrepreneurship, and that's what we have done. 3 messages mainly in my presentation. The first is there is more than traditional manufacturing, and therefore looking at entrepreneurship is important. Secondly, policy for entrepreneurship, what to do. And finally, in particular, I focus on 3 issues: skills, clusters, and access to finance. Let me start, therefore, with the first. The first says there is more than traditional manufacturing. And in fact, in this new global context, there is a rapid growth of population in Africa. You know it very well. From 1 to 2 billion people was one of the subjects of our IAO in the past. And obviously, this means urbanization, means more middle classes, and means, therefore, increased internal demand, which is positive. On the other hand, there is an evolution for what concerns, let's say, competitors. Other emerging areas are now seeing and moving technologies one step further, and as a consequence, there are opportunities for less sophisticated competitors. Last but not least, technology. Technology is changing a lot the picture. Robotics, automation, artificial intelligence, but also additive manufacturing and industrial internet are creating new opportunities. In fact, in general, the minimum efficient scales is reducing. If we take the process of production and we decompose in discrete phases, what you need as a size to be efficient is not as big as it was in the past. If you prefer, the roof of our factories doesn't need to be enormous. Secondly, well, there is a certain possibility of diversification. We speak a lot about services. In many cases, this is diversification of manufacturing, which means that there are new niches where entrepreneurship can take place. And then logistics. The transaction costs in general have been reduced. So there are some possibility for leapfrogging, and Africa can replicate industrial growth of other areas. Now, the point is that even if this will happen, if the rate of industrialization of Asia, Southeast Asia, and in general East Asia will be achieved, this will not probably be enough in order to guarantee full employment of the young population which is arriving in the labor market. And therefore, the majority probably will work in self-employment. But therefore, what is the picture of self-employment at present? Well, you see here small young firms with fewer than 20 employees and less than 5 years of experience account for the largest share of the net job creation. They are at 22%. So we have to deal mainly with young entrepreneurs in very micro firms. And where are they specializing? As you can see, a large part, 55% of entrepreneurs, are now working in non-tradable services, which means retail trade, hotels, restaurants, that typically require lower skills than other activities. So a large share of the new entrepreneurs are mainly in non-tradable. Few African entrepreneurs are at present innovative. Less than 1/5 of African early-stage entrepreneurs offer new products or services to the market. Let me also add, given the important presence of ladies in the room, that there is also an issue concerning female entrepreneurship. Much more can be done, and it is prevented not only by difficulties in the labor market, but also the existence of certain social institutions. That means that sometimes the gap of entrepreneurship for women is more difficult to address. The second point is, therefore, policy. What can we do? First, there are different types of entrepreneurs, and we cannot pretend to have one policy that fits all. In fact, I was saying Africa opportunity-driven entrepreneurs account for 44% of entrepreneurs, which means that the remaining are mainly entrepreneurs by necessity. I don't find a job, therefore what do? I try to start up by myself. And you cannot address these two types of actors in the same way. You cannot address a traditional artisan which is serving mainly a local market with universal machines, with high tolerance, and that are not competitive, as you address a new entrepreneurs that creates a new product and a new market. They are different type of actors. Secondly, we know by experience in Africa that subsidies are not the right tool to address these entrepreneurs. Indiscriminated subsidies tend to reproduce what is already going on. Much more helpful is the creation of services, real services, that support skills for entrepreneurs, either in administration or technology dissemination or control of quality. That's much more effective. And therefore, refraining from subsidies for unproductive entrepreneurs remain particularly important. Third, when you are small, you cannot do everything inside, so you tend to buy instead outside. But the outside that you address is not that far. It's mainly the local environment. So one crucial element to strengthen entrepreneurs is also to strengthen the local economy. If it is bad, therefore it will be a factor of production and the product will be bad. In general, we observe 25 African countries that currently have a national strategy on industrial development. How much this strategy include element for entrepreneurship? Well, mainly industrialization strategies have focused on large firms and attraction of foreign direct investments. This is obviously a very important area to further industrialize. However, what is crucial is to address sectors that have backward and forward linkages. In my country, in the south, we had, and Fanitza knows it very well, we had investments that were often in petrochemical sectors, and we have created what we call cathedral in the deserts, because the impact on the local economy was limited, much better mechanic, much better other sector. Secondly, very often we tend to address capital-intensive activities whose impact on employment is not that great. So this policy should be adjusted in order to introduce elements more helpful. And here I come to my third point. What are the major areas that we think we should focus on? Obviously, there are a series of general context elements, such as the policy on electricity, that are required anyhow, and they are kind of horizontal elements that will introduce important factors helpful to any type of production. But three are the focus that we suggest. One is on skills, the second is on cluster, and the third is on finance. As for skills, only about 2 out of 6, or 2 or 6% of the educational budget is focused at present on skills. And obviously, formal training is crucial, but on-the-job training is very helpful as well. And the two things need to be connected strongly. They need to be connected on the local context, because obviously the answer that is given by the local labor market, where there is limited mobility, is fundamental. And obviously they need to involve all the actor concerns. You cannot design training without the entrepreneurs and without those that will use it. In Ghana, there are policies of apprenticeship that represent up to 90% of basic skill training. And there are other very interesting experiences in this direction, not to forget the importance of diasporas and what they can bring back in terms of skill that they have acquired in their life experience. Second, clusters. Among the different types of entrepreneurship, there is the fact that certain small activities are concentrated in spatial area. And the fact that you are in an area doing little things in a firms but connected with others is like to have a large firms without the roof. Inside you have very small firms, but they are connected. They are specialized and complementary to the others. Further strengthening this element allows to be small but to be competitive globally. And as such, the cluster represents a very interesting perspective. Now, what is needed as a policy for a cluster? Not the same thing that the policy for the large firms. You need public goods, obviously, and you need to intervene on this cooperation between the firms, not to mention helping them for further specialization. I will end by speaking about the financial aspects. And the financial aspect is that financing for young and innovative firms is difficult. But it's particularly difficult, apparently, in Africa, where African firms are 19% less likely to have a bank loan than in the other regions that I have mentioned. What are the tools that could be helpful? Well, for sure, things such as credit guarantee schemes do work very well for small firms and new firms, and they help to face some obstacles that exist when you deal with the financial sector. In certain cases, direct financing and support to high-growth African firms can help also to realize their potential. I have passed quickly because the time available is short, but I want to summarize the point. There is not only one type of small firms. There are different types of small firms, and they cannot be addressed in the same way. One thing is to address entrepreneurs by necessity that are in reality trying to create a job, and the majority of the time they remain always with the same size and under-employee. And other firms that are new entrepreneurs that target certain niches, or the clusters, where we have many small firms that, by remaining even small, can be particularly competitive if they learn to work together, complementing each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mario. And in case you want to continue this conversation online, the hashtag is the main hashtag for the conference. That's hashtag AFDBAM2017. That's hashtag AFDBAM2017. That conversation is going on. You see me very busy on my phone. The conversation is going on very keenly on Twitter and all other platforms. I want to invite the second Italian who's on stage to our panel. She's an Italian by way of Chavacali, which is somewhere in Western Kenya. But that's Angela Luisigi, who's a strategic advisor for UNDP Africa. Angela.
Good morning, everyone. As you can see, I'm not Monsieur Abdoulaye Mardier, the Assistant Secretary General and the Regional Director for Africa for UNDP. I must convey his apologies. He was going to be here, but at the last minute was unable to make it and asked me to make these remarks. So we've heard everything about growth on the continent, but what does that mean for people? Africa's growth has resulted in rising human development. And when we talk about human development, we're talking about people's expanding opportunities and choices to live the lives they value so that they can be more and they can do more. So as you can see, 18 countries across Africa have achieved medium and high levels of human development, and that's a significant achievement. So we can see that our rise is not only because of growing economies, but because of improved living standards and human capabilities. And this is what creates the demand for goods and services and provides a high return for investment. And as my director likes to say, Africa is a new El Dorado for capital investors and entrepreneurs. So building on some of our analysis, I would like to propose 3 keys to unlock and accelerate the kind of entrepreneurship that pushes human development forward in Africa by looking at how we can change perceptions, frameworks, and financing. So one of the first things, just to put this into context, is that human development is rising, but it's uneven. And a big challenge is the fact that a few of the countries that are falling behind are facing political instability, conflict, climate change, and disasters, which means that 68% of Africans live in a country with a high fragility status. And as a result, 54% of Africans in 46 African countries, which is about 544 million people, are still considered multidimensionally poor. But the key to remember is that it is rising, but it's uneven, and we need to do something about it. So why focus on entrepreneurship? Let's look at the words of Joseph Schumpeter. Innovation is a driving force of economic progress in general, and entrepreneurs are the agents of innovation. So entrepreneurship is important because it's the engine and the spirit that drives private sector engagement and human development, because it allows a society to capture and transform opportunities. So this entrepreneurial innovation creates decent jobs. It also drives structural transformation, reduces poverty and inequality. And on the other hand, improving human capabilities expands entrepreneurship. So for us, it's important because we see that promoting entrepreneurship could be one of the most effective tools for turning Africa's youth bulge into a demographic dividend. But there is a but, and this is if and only if, as economists like to say, there's equal access to entrepreneurship capabilities and opportunities, and they're assured for girls and boys, women and men, wherever they may live. So one of the things that has come out from our report is that Africans value entrepreneurship. They see it as a good career choice, and that's a much higher percentage than in other regions. But we see that there are challenges that block the development of vibrant entrepreneurship, and as a result, we see youth unemployment, skills gap, and binding inequality in access to resources and opportunities. So this is why the three keys that we'd like to put forward is what has already been discussed before about changing the perception and behavior away from necessity-driven entrepreneurship to more opportunity-driven entrepreneurship, and also looking at entrepreneurship-friendly policy frameworks as we move away from factor-driven economies to efficiency and innovation-driven economies. And finally, also, how can we blend internal and external financing so that we can focus more on the strategic investments that we need for wider scale effects and positive externalities? So, as was mentioned before, we have the highest rate of young entrepreneurs, but many of them are driven out of necessity compared to other regions, and most of them operate in low value added sectors. So the first key to success is to raise the value of entrepreneurship and to looking at the famous words of Hernando de Soto, el otro sendero, the other path for development. So this is a path that can unleash high creativity and transform our opportunities into phenomenal realizations. And as we have said in our report, we need to look at two things: the intrinsic characteristics of the potential entrepreneur, as well as the social economic environment in which they operate. And one of the key things that we have looked at is how we can have education systems to move away from an overemphasis on theory and look more at how they can include practical skills, including how to finance and how to grow resilient businesses. And this we can do through internships, apprenticeships, mentorships, and on-the-job training. The second key to success is, as was mentioned, is through industrial policy, because most of our policies focus on resource-based and capital-intensive industry. And we want to see how we can shift away from that focus so that we stop hampering the potential for innovation and creativity of African entrepreneurs. And Mario has mentioned some of the things that we can do about it. But also some of the other tools we can look at is looking at local content policies and targeted public procurement, la commande publique, as a strategic policy lever to advance job creation, local supply chains, technology transfer, and enterprise development. And this is a huge opportunity because public procurement represents up to 50% of government spending or 7.5% of GDP. And we can boost local SMEs' provision of products and services such as office supplies, vehicles, office electronics, and catering. And good examples we can see from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, where by law, 20% of the procurement is reserved for SMEs. And in Kenya, the government has a preferential procurement policy which has reserved 30% of the procurement for enterprises that are owned by youth, women, and the disabled. And third, we must see how we can blend the surge in internal financing with the enhanced external financing. From the report, we see that we have inward FDI and portfolio investments which are growing and expect to reach 62.7 billion in 2017. And this is up from 13 billion in 2000. We've also seen remittances which have increased sixfold since 2000 and are projected to reach 66.2 billion in 2017. And this will actually be 15 billion more than ODA. So building on the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which calls for effective growth and utilization of domestic resources for Africa's development, we can focus beyond tax revenues, we can look at pension funds, and we can also look at sovereign wealth funds. And in addition to this, we can also look at how we can target better external public and private financial flows, which are critical for development. So our challenge today is to shift away from attracting more aid towards harnessing and effectively channeling blended financing for strategic investments in the sectors with the greatest economies of scale and positive social and environmental externalities. And finally, let me conclude by saying that Africa is indeed on a sturdy path for growth and human development, but the momentum will need to be accelerated and amplified to reach the vision set in the African Union's Agenda 2063, the Global Agenda 2030, and the High Fives towards a prosperous, peaceful, and integrated continent. Building on the momentum of the past 15 years of steady economic growth, and the next 15 years up to 2030 when we realize the Sustainable Development Goals, it may be possible to say that Africa has concluded its 30 glorieuses, its glorious 30 years. But in order to scale up and achieve this vision, Africa must consolidate and actively promote entrepreneurship spirit, sanctify the culture of entrepreneurship, and adequately fund entrepreneurship. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Angela, and a warm round of applause to all the three presenters. And a special one to Angela, who claims she was unprepared. So I'd hate to see what happens when she actually is prepared to make a presentation. Now, we want to hear a few responses very briefly, and then also come to you, our audience in the room. And the first response I will ask for is from Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, who's the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, moderator. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor and a great pleasure to be invited to the launch of the African Economic Outlook 2017. This is indeed an excellent publication. We wait for it every year. It is driven by solid, factual-based analysis, and we really appreciate this. We were part of this trio, which were 4 of us, and I hope the situation will prevail that will bring us back to be partner again on this excellent publication. And our new Executive Secretary, Vera Songwe, is in this room and listening to my comments, and I hope my intervention. I think the report in its 3 parts, the first part, which is the permanent chapters, whether it's macro, trade, and others, and then the thematic part, and the last one on the country briefs, continues to be an excellent format, and I hope you will preserve that. Of course, I will fully agree with the analysis of the report on the performance and prospects of the continent. Of course, the fundamentals remains solid, whether it is prudent macroeconomic policies and management, or improved business environment, high level of urbanization, growing middle-income class, and increased public spending, and particularly domestic demand. This continue to drive growth in the continent. Of course, you know the problems and challenges of this growth, whether it's quality and all that. But I think, as the report like to put it, there are challenges at the short term. But I think in the long run, the fundamentals remains correct. Of course, the diversity of the continent still also remains. Commodity exporters doing less better than the non-commodity exporters. And I think this is happening in the global environment. With all what was said, I would like to add just 2 things there in this context. The rising protectionism and rising nationalism, particularly in the North. I would like to believe these are issues that is going to shape a number of years as we move ahead. But I also think they come with opportunities. Those who were prescribing for us for a number of years want to go inwards. I think that gives us, it can only free us to shape our destiny and take our future at hand. Let me come now to the theme of the report, which is on entrepreneurship and industrialization. I think this is the right theme. It's very relevant and timely. And from the perspective and the work of the ECA, I would like to say here there is convergence of views and thinking, in the sense that at ECA over the last 6-7 years, we have focused on the industrialization, actually transforming Africa through industrialization. And let me share with you here maybe 3 findings which are also confirmed by the report itself. Number 1, Africa has a comparative advantage to promote economic transformation through commodity-based industrialization and to address, and this is probably the surest way of addressing poverty, inequality, and unemployment. In this connection, I think promoting agro-industry would enhance productivity and increase the incomes of smallholder farmers that dominate this sector. I think we need to shift gear here. The idea of continuing exporting raw materials, whether it is minerals or commodities, has to stop. Africa must be serious about adding value to its product. Second, trade continues to play a vital role in Africa's economic growth performance. And it has the potential to promote trade-induced industrialization. And I think, therefore, our countries should continue to pursue trade, and in particular regional trade, given its strong correlation with structural transformation through industrialization. And third, greening industrialization is an important for Africa to achieve the type of structural transformation that yield sustainable and inclusive growth, creating jobs again, while safeguarding the productivity of natural resources, assets including marine resources and green and blue economy, in order to avoid a development first and a cleanup later mindset. Exploring the menu of renewable energies will unlock green industrialization. This is even more crucial given current urbanization trends in the continent and the need to cater for essential services for an ever-increasing urban population. I think to achieve this transformation, 3 factors come to play. Let me just briefly flag them. First, there is a need for quality and effective governance and institutions. And second, effectiveness of development policy. And third, availability of technical and financial resources to implement development programs. On the first two, there is remarkable progress that has been achieved in governance, institutions, and development policies over the past decade. And I think the African Economic Outlook makes this point very clearly. However, the availability of resources remain a significant challenge. And the paradox is that Africa is a resource-rich continent and has huge base of potential financial resources. Such resources, if harnessed well, are sufficient to meet significant portions of the continent's development needs. In spite the beneficial impact over the years of the ODA, I don't think it is sufficient to meet Africa development need, but also I think it will not be the route to Africa's transformation. There is, I think, therefore, the continent must break with the past and look within. It must rely on its own domestic financial resources for the sustainable solutions of its development finance. Therefore, I would like to believe there is enough evidence that the fundamentals exist for the continent to raise substantially more financial resources domestically in order to implement its development programs. And here I would like to think, and I will conclude with this, about 5 areas. 1, we need to adopt national development plans in order to further mobilize domestic resources for structural transformation and sustainable development. And I think here the global frameworks and regional frameworks, whether it is 2030 or 2063, provide an ample framework for that journey. The good news also, there is revival of long-term development planning in our countries. Most of our countries today are experimenting with visions 2020, 2030, 40, and all that. So this is very much welcome. Second, boosting tax revenue, generation and public investment expenditure in priority areas of infrastructure, agriculture, and human development, while ensuring financial and debt sustainability, which is something we need to be very maybe concerned about. And here I would like to believe the high fives of the bank are opportune, are optimal, and are really addressing this. Third, leveraging external support to enhance capacity to domestic resource mobilization and its utilization in priority areas defined by our countries. And fourth, strengthen regional and sub-regional capacity for economic transformation through improving transparency and accountability in public finance and in mineral resource management. And fifth and finally, ensuring global cooperation and coordination to enhance Africa's fiscal space by stemming tax evasion, encourage tax information and exchange, and reversing the proceeds of illicit financial resources. It's key to our financial resources. With these brief remarks, I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdallah Hamdok. Now, there are three things that jump out at me from just listening to these presentations, from looking at a bit of the conversation that's going on online. And we'll try and explore this if we have a bit of time. The first one, well, one of them is actually more by its absence from the three presenters, which is the international situation. And by this, is something that Dr. Hamdok has hinted towards, which is the rising protectionism that's starting to become evident in the world, and rising nationalism is how he puts it. We've seen what's happening. I think all of us are tired of hearing the phrase now, or the term Brexit. We have seen what's happened to the election last year in the United States. But also, the international situation includes what's happening elsewhere. So I think it was just last week when there was this big conference in China that's looking and affects Africa by way of, partly by way of its development. So the international situation is one of them. The second one that is very interesting, and it's one that's raising the most amount of comments online, at least on my social media presence, which is the nature of entrepreneurship. And I think that is one that's going to be discussed quite a bit. One, the fact that entrepreneurship in Africa tends to be more by necessity than by choice, and that means that it's necessarily less innovative than it should be. It also leads to lack of financial resources. It leads to companies that start and die young. So now, when you speak about mortality in Africa, it's not so much child mortality as it is corporate mortality. And the third one, which is sort of the broader rubric of structural transformation, if I dare add the issue of leapfrogging. So 20 years ago, for about a decade, Africa managed to leapfrog the world when it comes to telephony. So we jumped straight from having nothing to having very broad mobile telephony. So are we able to do the same with other parts of the economy, with other parts of technology? And I think that Mario hinted towards that when he spoke about the nature of manufacturing. So those broad issues to me are what jumped out, and we'll probably try and explore some of that. But I don't want to hog this microphone, so I want to come to you, ladies and gentlemen, on the floor. And I'll begin, if I may, with the President. President Adesina, is there anything that you feel you wanted to comment on or add on to this? If you are, then please feel free to come up.
Well, good morning, everyone, and let me say that it was a great pleasure to be here this morning and to listen to the presentation of the African Economic Outlook. A number of things actually jump out to me that I think are very, very critical. First and foremost is that it's very clear from these presentations that African economies remain very, very resilient. And that word resilient is particularly important because, you know, I am not a great swimmer, but I do know something about swimming, that if you're swimming and your head is above the water, you're doing well. And in a global environment in which you're looking at the global growth rates that have been, in 2016 at 3.1%, 2017 at going to about 3.5%, and 2018 projected to be about 3.8%. But if you look at the points that they're raising, even though Africa's growth rate was 2.2% in the aggregate, but it's projected to rise to 3.4% this year. But next year, it's supposed to rebound to about 4.3%. That's very, very important, that Africa's head is actually above the waters. Second point to take home is the fact that Africa is not just one country. Africa is 54 countries. There's a huge amount of heterogeneity in the growth processes that you see. And I think that if you take countries like Cote d'Ivoire, that is growing at roughly about 8.2%, 8.3%. Ethiopia, Abebe's country, is growing at 8%. You look at countries like, we're here with Kenya and Rwanda. They are growing at 6% each. Tanzania at 7.2%. Djibouti at 6.3%. It just tells you, Senegal about maybe 7.2%. So it tells you that the growth is actually very, very heterogeneous. And I'm delighted to hear from the report that Africa still remains the fastest growing region, second fastest growing region in terms of foreign direct investments. So I think that's very important to bear in mind. The other thing that I wanted to comment on is what you said about the skills. I think we must pay attention to this issue of the skills for young people. The population of Africa's youth today, which is roughly about 480 million people, will rise to another 840 million people by 2050. And that's going to make Africa the youngest continent, if you wish. It's actually quite scary, though. 38 out of the 40 countries that are going to have the youngest population in the world by 2050 are going to be in Africa. And the median age of Africa's youth, Africa's population, will be 25 years old. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we do with this youth? If we actually unlock the potential of this youth, and I think, Mary, you were talking about the issue of skills, good education, good skills, technology and technical and vocational education, that gives them the capacity to unlock their entrepreneurship. Africa can and should become the workforce of the future. After all, in the rest of the world, you have rapidly aging population. So if you can do that in Africa, Africa will become the workforce. One of the statistics that jumped out to me is the issue of access to finance that you were saying. It's actually quite disturbing to see that even though we lead with 22% in terms of entrepreneurship, majority of that from your slide is that it's in the retail business, the service sector in which you have low productivity and low profitability. But most of that is because of lack of access to finance. Today, you look at Africa in terms of access to finance for those businesses that you're talking about. 60% of the SMEs in Africa today get access to finance from banks. But only 2% of them get access to finance for long-term finance that they need to grow their businesses. So a lot of work still needs to be done in making the banking system respond to small and medium-sized enterprises' needs. And then just to close with the points that were raised by my dear brother, Doc, from the Economic Commission for Africa, he raised a very important point there about diversification. I think Abebe also raised it in terms of diversification, both in terms of product diversification, but also market diversification. Very critical for Africa in the sense that Africa has agriculture. That's what this annual meeting is about. Africa has agriculture. But the key is, as he said, to move to commodity-based industrialization, move to the top of the value chain for rice, for cassava, for cocoa, for coffee, for things that Africa produces. It should not be at the bottom of the value chain. It has to be at the top of the value chains. So all in all, I think that the prospects for Africa look very good. People call me Africa's chief optimist-in-chief. I'm very happy to be Africa's optimist-in-chief because I do believe that when you see a continent like ours with the kind of resources that we have, and if we can manage to reduce the illicit capital flows that you mentioned, increase savings rate that you mentioned, increase investments by improving business and investment regulatory environment, I think Africa will be unstoppable. So I'm very excited about your report, and I congratulate you for a great job.
Thank you very much, President Deshina. And much as you say you're not a swimmer, what you have is 90% of the way. If you keep your head above water, you'll be fine, if you remember that. So in the very, very, very brief time that we have remaining to us, I want to come to you, our dear audience members on the floor, in case there's anything you want to address in the report, especially by way of questions. I see a hand right at the back. I think that's Mr. Kasuja. There's a hand here. I'll just remind you to stand up, please, say your name and the institution that you represent, and please keep it very, very, very brief. There's no question 1, 2, and 3. I don't even want question 1A, B, or C. Question 1A only. And if there's any comment, keep it under a minute. So if the microphones are ready, if one can go right to the back to the gentleman in the dark top, I'll give you a microphone here and just take questions. Ladies and gentlemen of the media, you notice the president is departing. One of the reasons he's doing so is because at 11:30, which is in about 9 minutes from now, he will be holding or hosting a press conference downstairs. So in case you want to go there, in the next 2 or 3 minutes, you can start taking your cameras down and go down, but we will still be here for the next few minutes just to try and address the questions raised. Excuse me. So this microphone is here at the front. If another one can go to the back where the gentleman is standing, so we can do them quickly and in order. Please, sir.
Let me just, my name is Ali Isa. I'm working with a research institute in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, called HESPI. I'm particularly pleased about all 4 main speakers putting emphasis on the critical constraint of finance in developing, transforming, as well as sustaining growth in the continent. My question, or rather, I don't want to take a long time on this, is we have extreme system of localized finance in the continent. We've been trying to integrate the economies of the continent for close to 50, 100 years. But if you look at the financial side, the constraints are even much more compartmentalized, if you will. Now, my question is, with all the emphasis you have put in, I would like the speakers again maybe to reflect on this. What exactly does it take for Africa to build a continental financial system, or a regional financial system for that matter, simply put?
Thank you. Alan, you can be seen by everyone, but put your hand up again. The microphone is coming to you. Anyone else, or I need to know? And here in the middle, okay. And right there at the end, I see you.
Thank you very much. Oh, okay, sorry, I'll lower my voice a bit. Thank you very much, Wallace, for that. I wonder about the politics, the relationship between the politics and economic performance. Nobody's talking about that. And it's interesting to point out that the countries, I wonder if it's also time, depending again on the figures that you're coming up with, whether it might be time for Africa to rethink its politics because of certain trends that are quite obvious in the numbers that are coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. There's a lady who is dressed in a very lovely pink top. So as the microphone is coming down to her, there's one microphone here. If you can just please stand up, sir. Excuse me, sir. Please. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks a lot. My name is Frederick Kwame Kuma. I'm from the Worldwide Fund for Nature. My question is actually that the presentation was actually quite good in terms of Africa's growth, Africa's implications, growth implications on people, and all of that was really positive. But we all do know that growth has direct implications on the ecology. And I'm wondering if this report has looked at the implications of growth on natural capital. How do we unlock natural capital without depleting it? We think there is a sweet spot. That doesn't have to be an opposition here, but we need to think carefully about financial flows and how that supports growth in a positive and a sustainable way. And how does this report address that.
Thank you. The ecology is a very important bit. The gentleman behind you, if we just pass the microphone to him, but in the meantime, the lady, please go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Gerda Verburg. I'm the coordinator of the Scaling Up Nutrition Movement. I have been listening with great interest to the very positive economic outlook. I'm wondering how the thought of the forum is on resilience building, because the vulnerability of so many African countries to crisis, man-made or climate-made, are so big, and we know that families, especially children and women, are most vulnerable. How to improve and increase resilience in a structural and durable way? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
My name is Sunil Parekh. I've spent a long time in Nigeria and in Kenya. The question that I have is that if government procurement policy is going to play a central role in kickstarting the entire job opportunities and economic growth model, our experience here has been that it is a very weak link, because the issue of quality...
Here being India?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Where the issue of quality in supplies to the government doesn't allow governments to procure at any percentage target that they have. How are you going to deal with this, and what is the experience in Kenya?
Okay. Yes.
David Wilcox, Reach Scale. Everybody's mentioned diversity, and yet the question that almost never gets answered is how does Africa take advantage of its diversity? And the global corporations actually answered that question in a completely different venue a dozen years ago. And what they did is they asked themselves, what's the probability that we have more than 2 or 3% of the best answers and innovations inside our walls? And the answer to the question is 0. And every country can ask that same question. What's the probability that we have more than a few percentage of the best models, best innovations, best social innovations inside our walls? And a truthful answer to that question is 0. So the question then becomes, how do the 54 labs across the African continent share the best examples within their borders with all of the other labs, and then how do you scale the best examples from each country across the continent? You don't want to give entrepreneurship to everybody. You want to find the best and get them to lead.
Right, thank you. Is there any question I missed? Yes, here, and any other? Just put your hands up very high. Tend to have 6 eyes. Yes, so I see just 2 of them. So you and you. In the meantime, I might pick on
Thank you very much.
If you just hold on, sir. I might just pick on a certain finance minister I know to answer the question of how to ensure quality when it comes to government procurement, especially in the case of Kenya. But yes.
Thank you very much, Franklin Lask from the University of Warwick in the UK. I find the report interesting, but I would like to get the view of the panel on one important issue, and that is productivity. I'm convinced that this is the key to industrialization, probably more so than even capital, because if you look at the relevance and importance of international competitiveness, and if you look at the fact that, or take into account the fact that the lower end of global manufacturing is actually looking for investment places in where wages are relatively competitive, we need to factor in productivity. I think that's the missing link. If we can get productivity into the equation, Africa would be in a much better position to attract foreign investment as well as to be internationally competitive. So I would like to know precisely what recommendations can be made, not just for skills formation, but to raise labor productivity. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, just put your hand up again, please. Oh, there's 2 of them. So you, sir, and then you on the left, well, to my left, there. Those are the 2 final ones, and then we'll take submissions from the panel and wind up. So if the microphone can, just put your hands up, please. We need to be seen, or stand up. It's easier, yes. And you, sir, also, if you can please just stand up. The next gentleman, just stand up, please. Just so you're easier to see. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Deepak Parekh, and I represent a company called Microp. I'm a CEO of that company. We are working in agriculture using technology. My question is that actually, like, rural economy is the key for success of Africa. And when we talk about entrepreneurship and utilization, so what we are talking about, how we are going to integrate the rural populace to ensure that actually, like, I'll say that the difference between the having all and not having anything, that doesn't rise to the way it has rise in other part of the world.
Thank you. And you finally, sir?
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. The key theme emerging out
Sorry,
of the
your name, please.
Oh, my name is Samuel. I'm a senior advisor for the constituency of Gambia, Liberia, Sudan, Sierra Leone, and Ghana. The key theme emerging out of the presentation is industrialization and entrepreneurship. So the fundamental question then is, how is the global development community, business community, marshaling the forces on industrialization? I mean, aid resources, financing for Africa's entrepreneurship and industrialization. This is the only path any country has ever taken since time to achieve development. The United States, OECD countries, the BRICS, there's no other path. It's clear, economic science documents that. I was looking at ODA, and I hope Pisani can talk about that, ODA statistics on the share of assistance to industrialization in Africa is pretty low. How is it that we recognize that this is an important elephant in the room, yet at the global stage, the marshaling of resources to address this binding constraint is minimal? Right. What is the evolution? How are we addressing this change? And I think until we do that, we just have this conversation in the seminar. So I really want to hear on how is that changing from the OECD's perspective, from development aid perspective, putting more money into skills building, so that the share goes up relative to other priorities that partners are funding. Thank you.
Thank you. And so before we take, there's quite a number of questions, although I suspect some of them can be clustered. I want to pick on you, Finance Minister Rotich, from Kenya, Henry Rotich. There's a question that came with regard to procurement, government procurement, and trying to balance, if I got the question correctly, between the fact that you want to have a quota, in Kenya's case it's 30%, but also ensuring you're getting quality, so you don't just go and order chairs, and when you're sitting in a cabinet meeting, the president and his cabinet fall down because the chairs are not quality enough. I think that's the best way of putting it. So, Minister Rotich, feel free to come up here. I can get a microphone to you.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank the Indian government for hosting us. I think we have enjoyed the hospitality since our arrival, and the panelists and the presenters for the excellent presentation. Before I address your question, let me just take this opportunity to also just make a small comment on the presentations that have been made. First, I think on the issue of the outlook and the macro environment, I must say, yes, the report broadly captures really what's happening in our continent, and thank you for the good work on that. Just wanted to emphasize the issue of the diversification. That is very critical. Some of the growths that we are seeing, or the resilience that we are seeing in many countries in Africa, is because of the diversification. As in Kenya, for example, quite a diversified economy, and we have been able to grow at slightly higher than the average, as I already mentioned. So that really emphasizes the need for structural transformation if we have to continue to grow as a country. So I wanted to support that work. Of course, investments are very key. Growth is being driven by consumption. We are doing a lot to try to increase investment, public investment, and also FDI. The quality of those investments are also very important, and also how do we attract public-private partnership to increase this. Those are very key. I think on the topic of industrialization and entrepreneurship, it's very key. We have seen in many African countries, and also in Kenya in particular, manufacturing has stagnated, in our case, at around 10% for almost 2 decades, meaning that either we have paid less attention, or more needs to be done, especially export-led industrialization. I think the key issues really also there is that we can't move away from the fact that we needed to invest in the critical or the fundamentals, particularly on the energy and transportation that are key to attract industries. So investments in energy are still important. There's no way you can attract an investor if your energy costs are still high. So at least those are the things that we are paying a lot of attention. They're still important. But at the same time, I think we've done a lot on that area. We now need to begin to put together important policies to spur industrialization, given that most of our countries have already invested in these fundamentals which are key. And that I think the next focus really is the sort of policies that you have laid here to support entrepreneurship and start restarting manufacturing in our countries. So that is very important. I think on just related to the issue that has been raised on small business and entrepreneurship, yes, it is important that finance has been a constraint, entrepreneurial skills has also been a constraint, and market access. I think most of our countries, we've made interventions in these three areas. But I must say that they have not been very coordinated, which has actually created the challenge. Yes, in Kenya, we have access to public procurement at around 30% for all the procurement, but we have not seen high uptake of that. Reason is also access to finance and the skills. So I think what is very important is to how do we tie this together so that if you have an entrepreneur, does he have the necessary skills to produce? Does he access the financing that we have put in place? And does he access the market that we have created? So I think we need sort of an institutional and a legal framework that can actually tie this together as a chain so that it can work. And I have in mind like what has been done sometimes in the US, what they call Small Business Act. I think this is something that we may want to also to look at it so that if you're an entrepreneur, you can access cheap financing that we have already put in place. In Kenya, we have many finances, women enterprise funds, youth enterprise funds, Uwezo funds, all at almost interest-free. But they are not accessed because they are not tied to entrepreneurs who are already being trained and also the market access that we are creating through public procurement system. So I think a legal and institutional framework that ties this together can really help and have in mind getting another legal framework, a law. The companies laws that we have cannot really spur small entrepreneurs, so we need a dedicated legal framework. I think that is something important. So just to finalize on the issue, yes, on the issue of quality, very important. I must confess, even the chair that I sit in the office is coming from China. The reason is that because our local entrepreneurs cannot produce a very smooth chair that we normally like to procure. But I am told actually the issue really is getting the right tools. To get a soft finish like this podium, you need some very, tools. And to get those tools, you need financing to acquire. So this is something that we are really looking at how to improve the quality of our entrepreneurs. Now that we have given them access, we tell them, okay, we want to buy your chairs, we want to buy your tables and all that, but this is the quality that we need. So we're trying to assist them to ensure that they can finish their products to meet the demands that we need, so that we don't just give them an opportunity, but they have to have the necessary skills and the tools to actually do that, and that means financing to prove the tools. We are still using very rudimental rudimental tools which cannot produce the quality that we need. And I think we need to borrow the appropriate technologies to do that. So all these must be tied together in the skill development. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. We need to, in literally about 25 seconds, wrap up the entire thing. So to my four respondents, you have exactly 6.5 seconds each. We also recognize that, I'm not sure, but we may have the presence of the Finance Minister of Algeria. I'm not sure whether he's here, but in case he is, we want to recognize you. But starting with Dr. Hamdok, I think your microphone, your lapel microphone works. Very, very, very briefly. It should, they'll switch it on. So very, very briefly, respond to anything you feel was thrown at you from the questions from the floor. And final submissions, you have 6.5 seconds starting now.
Thank you very much. I think I'll respond to maybe 3 of them, if you allow me. Number one, on the question from my friend, Dr. Ali Issa, on the fragmented financial institution in the continent. You are absolutely right. But I think Africa is not short of frameworks. The Abuja Treaty milestones provide the roadmap for that. And we expect to build the African Economic Community by 2034 or somewhere. Of course, we are much behind that. This year marks the or maybe the establishment of the Continental Free Trade Area. You can imagine if you were to achieve it, that will give us ample opportunities of having harmonization of the trade area. But I think our publication on the regional financial, the assessing of regional integration has an excellent expose of the assessment of the integration, and particularly in the macroeconomic convergence and financial institutions. There is a diversity of this. East African community is doing much better than the rest of the continent in this respect, followed by maybe ECOWAS because of probably the franc zone there, the one currency and all that. Of course, unless and until we have one market that addresses this, we are not getting anywhere. The second point, just briefly, on the, there are 2 or 3 questions on the resilience, natural capital, and all that. I think for Africa, as latecomers, it is in our interest to embrace green, blue economy. If the world is going green technology and all that, as latecomers, we should leapfrog to that. Why should we commit the mistakes of others who came before us? We are very rich in renewable energy, solar energy, wind and hydro, technology, agriculture, greening agriculture, afforestation programs will not only create jobs and employment opportunities for our rural population, but also we can contribute to the public good of providing this carbon sink and all that. So that is one. The third one is on the productivity raised by my friend, Professor Lisk. It is absolutely necessary. Industrialization goes through the increase of productivity, of capital, of labor, and all that. That goes through technology. It is so disheartening to see our farmers up to today using hand hoes. There's no way we can link to any kind of commodity change, regional or global value chains, if we do not embark on technology, innovation. Innovation is context specific. You can import the most advanced technology from the world, but you have to link it to your context, your specificity, and all that. And we have to think seriously about research and development. How many of our countries put any resources on research and development? You walk into our centers of excellence and knowledge universities, which were much better 50 years ago. Today, they are totally defunct. We need to think about this as Africans, and put that right. And finally, to the friend from Ghana, on the industrialization, I think I fully agree with you. No country in the world could develop without embarking on industrialization as a serious process, not something that comes by its own. It must be led by the state, and the experience of this region, Southeast Asia also, tells us one thing. It is the industrialization that is led by the state as in front of this. Yes, private sector and others can help, but the state has to have a vision, society has to have a vision, and you need to seriously say where you want to take your society in the next 20, 30, 40 years, development becomes hegemonic, and who lead that process, it doesn't matter. It must be a society project and a society vision. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Angela, since Abdallah has eaten your time, you have 4 seconds.
That's not fair.
Hit him.
I'm going to be very brief because I feel that my colleagues on my right will do the heavy lifting. But I just wanted to respond to the comment on politics and economics. I think that is very right, because we're talking about you can't move anything forward without looking at the political economy. Now, the good news is that according to the Mo Ibrahim Index, 70% of Africans are living in countries where governance is improving. So that is the good news. But I think we still have a long way to go in looking at African-centric models of governance. And this has to happen, of course, at the national level, where we look at both the supply and the demand and the social contract, but also I think our regional institutions are also doing a good job of getting better at enforcing some of these governance contracts. So I'm happy that, especially when you look at the example of what happened in Gambia and so forth, that there's really is a push from outside and from inside to see how we can move this forward. There was a question on the growth and natural capital. I won't say much on this, only to say that we had a very nice AEO on structural transformation and natural resource governance. And I think that is a very critical thing to look at, because we see that in the context of Africa, we really depend on our natural resources, and we have to see how we can spring forward while also conserving this asset and using this as a means to diversify into the other sectors of industrialization. And then on the question about resilience building, this is very true, because we saw with the example of what happened with Ebola. This is all about resilience. So you have to anticipate before it happens. So we're looking at how we can work more at the institutional level to make sure that our institutions are resilient, prepare, and then also adapt so that we can respond better to disasters and so forth. So resilience building definitely is key. And then finally, on the procurement policy, I think I was saved by the representative from Kenya. So we're definitely looking, I only mentioned the demand side, but definitely we have to look at the supply side and how it all knits together. Thank you.
Okay, telegraphically, on the continental financial system, obviously I agree. I will put a strong emphasis on the word system. A system implies that you need also to have local level of financing crucial. In general, local banking is capable to use trust much more than national or continental actors. As such, they play a role as first lender that needs to be taken into account. Secondly, about ODA and industrialization, I agree. ODA have paid little attention to issues in general of productivities and industrialization. There is something done under the heading aid for trade, but under my point of view is insufficient. As for growth, I don't think we have addressed growth. I'm very sorry. I think we have started 5 years ago addressing an issue that was demographic change. That is unprecedented in history in terms of volume and speed. And therefore, either we are capable to use the opportunity created by young population joining society, not only labor market, or we will face major issues, major problems. And as such, we have told each other, what can we do in order to guarantee a capacity to absorb this new generation? These may concentrate on growth, as well as we may concentrate on well-being, and in general, on inclusiveness. So it's not growth, the emphasis. The emphasis is a very practical issue, how to find jobs that are sustainable for this increase in demography. And in fact, we have looked at different possibilities. This year was entrepreneurship. Last year, or 2 years ago, was about rural development. We were all convinced the population will increase not only in urban areas, but also in rural areas, and therefore what to do in rural? And the answer is not only agriculture. In many countries, at different stages of development, employment in rural areas in agriculture represents only 5% of the total, which means we need to figure out also non-farm employment, but with a focus on rural. I totally agree. And therefore, what we are addressing is much more productivity and way to create jobs. The point is not growth. The point is the type of growth, the quality of growth. And that's why we are addressing structural phenomena and not just macro-quantitative objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario. Finally, Abebe. Now you have 2 seconds.
Okay, I will not penalize everyone, so I'll just be extremely very brief. Actually, I'm very grateful, Honorable Minister, for your response. Basically, you have said it all. The Kenyan experience, if you listen very carefully what is said, basically answers all of the questions that were raised. But just a couple of points. I would like to refer to the financial integration that our colleague spoke about. I don't have the numbers here, but we have a high-level lab on financial. Dr. Urdu there and his colleague, they have done quite an extensive thought experiment. You could talk to them afterwards. If all the reserves of African countries, for instance, imagine a world in which Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, 54 African countries breathe and feel the same way, and reserves can float around easily, how much the continent could raise. They can tell you the number. This is staggering. Which means, basically, there is a lot of potential for intra-Africa financial integration for development. But finally, I think an issue that has not been addressed so far is about social protection. How do we, for instance, in this environment of high growth and hopefulness, there are so many also millions of Africans who live in abject poverty and vulnerability. So what are the steps needed to be taken in the interim until growth trickles down? I think there are also very useful experience from Rwanda, for instance, if you take the community-based effort that the country has made. The social protection program is so extensive. We have studied it. And in Rwanda, for instance, just because the government has been able to provide health insurance for more than 90%. Now the minister can verify that he's here. Of the population, it's higher than in the US. People have basic health insurance, farmers, casual workers, people who are employed in the informal sector, and we have studied the impact. Is it really simply carrying a card to say they have insurance, or does it have a meaningful effect on vulnerability because of health-related shocks? Our result was extremely high. Even on poverty, the community-based health insurance has led a 10 percentage point reduction in poverty just because people were enrolled in that insurance. So basically, there are countries we are now starting to learn from in Africa, where unprecedented interventions by governments, just commitments, organizing the community, has made a lot of headway in terms of protecting the vulnerable from unforeseen shocks. And I hope this practice will continue across the continent, and then we'll be seeing more inclusive and equitable society. Thank you, and we all appreciate your presence here. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And again, a warm round of applause, not just to our panel, but also to all of you. So that marks the end of this session, the African Economic Outlook. But like we told you, there's soft copies on flash lists, which are just as you go out the door. The second announcement to make is to please leave your translation devices on the chairs. So just leave them there, they'll be picked up.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, and before you all leave, I want you to come just for a photo opportunity to sort of do a launch of the reports.
Absolutely.
So please, cameramen and everyone, just come around and help us. So please leave your translation devices on the chairs. The report is available to all of you at the doors as you depart.